get their statements. This has to be transparent, no spin. As Lawson hurried off to coordinate the press conference, Ethan felt a strange sense of both victory and trepidation, knowing that his actions had set something far-reaching into motion, something that couldn't be undone. He glanced back at the jet bridge where Eleanor was being gently escorted by an airport staff member, her frail figure moving slowly yet with an unmistakable dignity, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for her quiet resilience. Whatever happened next, Ethan knew that the battle for dignity and respect was far from over, and that standing up had been just the first step in a long, uncharted journey. As the press conference loomed closer, the atmosphere within O'Hare International Airport grew thick with anticipation, buzzing with the collective energy of journalists, setting up cameras and passengers milling about with phones in hand, scrolling through the latest updates and watching the video that had ignited a nationwide debate on human dignity and corporate accountability. Ethan found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the situation he had unwittingly thrust himself into, knowing that his decision to stand up for Eleanor was now more than just an isolated act of kindness. It had become a rallying cry for those who had long felt marginalized, dismissed, and disregarded by institutions that promised customer service but delivered conditional respect. He stood near the terminal windows, his hands resting on the cool metal railing as he watched planes taxi on the tarmac. The relentless movement of travel, a stark contrast to the stillness that had settled in his heart as he braced himself for what was to come. Just then, Mia appeared at his side, her face reflecting both determination and the weariness of someone who had spent hours fighting not just for the truth, but for the soul of a story that desperately needed telling. She glanced at him, offering a reassuring smile, and without a word, slid her phone into her pocket, signaling that for the moment she was just there as a friend rather than a journalist. Ethan gave her a grateful nod, appreciating the silent solidarity as he drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own resolve settling like iron within his chest. Across the terminal, Karen sat rigidly on a plastic chair near the airline's customer service desk, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned bone white. Travis stood beside her, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, clearly attempting to coach her through whatever corporate damage control strategy had been hastily concocted by Jenna Lawson and the airline's PR team. But Karen barely seemed to register his words, her eyes fixed on some indeterminate point in the distance, as her mind raced through the fallout that was cascading through her life like a relentless avalanche, crushing her professional reputation and dragging her name through the mud. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had always been the one in control, the one who maintained order and commanded respect, and yet now she found herself on the precipice of public condemnation, branded as a villain, not just by the media, but by countless strangers who had seen the video and made up their minds that she was the embodiment of everything wrong with corporate power and unchecked bias. She had been following orders, hadn't she? Maintaining protocols, upholding standards. So why did it all feel so hollow now? Why did she feel so exposed, as if the core of her identity had been peeled back to reveal something ugly and shameful, something that she could no longer rationalize away? Just as the thought tightened like a vice around her heart, Jenna Lawson approached briskly, clipboard in hand, her expression severe but oddly collected, as if she thrived on crisis management and saw this debacle as just another fire to extinguish. "Karen," Jenna said, her tone curt but not unkind, "we need to talk before the press conference. I need you to understand that the narrative has already shifted, and trying to justify your actions is only going to dig us deeper. Right now, it's about damage control. We're going to emphasize the stress and unpredictability of in-flight service, but you need to show genuine remorse. If we can convince the public that you're taking responsibility and committing to personal growth, we might salvage some of your career." Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry and aching, and forced herself to nod, though the words didn't quite sink in. She had never been one to admit fault. She had built her entire career on being right, on enforcing the rules with uncompromising authority, And now that same inflexibility was poised to destroy everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Jenna gave her one final assessing glance before moving off to confer with the media coordinator, leaving Karen alone once more to grapple with the sinking realization that no amount of corporate strategizing could erase what had been broadcast to millions. Meanwhile, in a quiet alcove near Gate B17, Eleanor sat calmly, her hands folded over her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed, as if she were absorbing the gravity of the situation without allowing it to overwhelm her spirit. A young airport staff member named Chelsea had been assigned to keep her company and ensure her comfort, offering water and a quiet space away from the media frenzy that had erupted in the concourse. Eleanor accepted the hospitality with quiet grace, though her mind remained on the unfolding drama and the many voices that had risen to her defense. She had never wanted to become a public figure or a symbol of anything. She just wanted a glass of water to take her medication. Yet now, as the world weighed in with passionate opinions and fierce debates, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of responsibility, as if she owed it to all the people who had reached out to her with their own stories of being treated as less than human. When Mia and Ethan approached, Eleanor greeted them with a gentle smile, sensing the unspoken tension in the way they held themselves, both bracing for the fight they knew was still ahead. "How are you holding up?" Ethan asked softly, his eyes full of concern. Eleanor gave a small shrug, her smile never faltering. "I've lived through worse," she replied with a touch of wry humor. "But I won't lie, this is something else. I never expected to be at the center of a storm like this." As they sat together discussing what to expect at the press conference, Mia's phone chimed with an alert, and her eyes widened as she scanned the screen. "They just announced it. Karen is going to make a statement alongside the airline's PR team," Mia reported, her voice taut with incredulity. "They're framing it as a personal apology and a commitment to better training, but it sounds like they're trying to spin it as a misunderstanding rather than outright negligence." Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration rippling through him as he processed the calculated manipulation unfolding behind the scenes. "Of course they're trying to spin it," he muttered. "They're more worried about their image than actually making things right." Eleanor reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm, and when he looked at her, she gave him a knowing nod. "Let them say what they will," she said quietly. "Truth has a way of finding its way through the noise. People saw what happened. They know it wasn't just a misunderstanding." Mia couldn't help but smile at Eleanor's quiet resilience, realizing that this woman's dignity remained unshaken, despite the chaos swirling around them. Just then, Chelsea returned with an update, informing them that the press conference would begin in 10 minutes, and that Ethan and Eleanor had been invited to attend if they wished to respond after Karen's statement. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, searching Eleanor's face for any sign of doubt. "It's going to be intense." Eleanor gave him a serene smile, her eyes reflecting a wisdom forged through decades of quiet strength. "I've never been one to back down from speaking my truth," she replied. "If they want to hear from me, then I'll make sure they hear what matters." With that, they made their way toward the makeshift podium that had been hastily assembled near the terminal's entrance, the crowd already thick with reporters and onlookers, their cameras trained on the platform where Karen and Jenna Lawson were preparing to speak. As the buzz of anticipation grew, Ethan noticed several familiar faces from the flight among the crowd, passengers who had witnessed the incident firsthand, and whose expressions ranged from grim determination to open support. When Karen finally stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd and she cleared her throat, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Good afternoon, Mick," she began, her voice wavering despite her attempts at control. "I would like to sincerely apologize to Mrs. Eleanor and to all passengers on Flight 287 for my actions and my lack of compassion during the incident. I allowed my adherence to protocol to overshadow my duty to treat every passenger with dignity and respect, and I deeply regret the pain I caused." She paused, swallowing hard as Jenna gave her a supportive nod, urging her to continue. I have agreed to undergo comprehensive training and to participate in community outreach efforts to better understand the impact of my actions, and I hope to earn back the trust of our passengers and my colleagues through genuine accountability and change. The silence that followed was heavy and strained, as if the crowd were collectively holding their breath, unsure whether to accept the apology or condemn it as hollow. Just then, Ethan felt a surge of resolve and glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a subtle nod, granting him permission to speak on her behalf. He stepped forward, taking the microphone from Jenna's hesitant grip, and faced the cameras with unwavering resolve. What happened on that flight wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment, he declared, his voice steady and strong. It was a reflection of a systemic issue, an attitude that sees some passengers as more deserving of respect than others. Mrs. Eleanor did nothing to warrant being treated as less than human, and no apology will mean anything unless it's followed by real change. We're not just demanding words, we're demanding accountability and a commitment to treating every passenger with the basic dignity they deserve. The crowd erupted in applause, and as Eleanor stepped forward to join him, her presence a powerful testament to the strength that had carried her through decades of silent battles, it became clear that the tide was turning. Not just for this one incident, but for every person who had ever been denied their humanity in the name of protocol. As the echoes of the press conference faded into the bustling hum of the airport, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle over everyone involved. Karen stood frozen near the podium, her heart pounding against her ribs as her eyes darted from one reporter to another, trying to gauge whether her carefully rehearsed apology had been enough to quell the public outrage. Her thoughts were spinning with the consequences that loomed ahead, her career hanging by a thread despite Jenna's best efforts to frame the narrative in a way that made her appear contrite and willing to change. But the world outside the airport was relentless, and social media was already ablaze with responses that ranged from sympathy for Eleanor to outright condemnation of Karen's behavior and the airline's corporate culture. Jenna glanced at Karen with a professional but guarded expression, subtly steering her toward the side exit where the PR team waited to usher her away from the growing chaos. Yet, as they moved, Karen couldn't help but catch glimpses of the crowd, where a mixture of faces stared back at her. Some judgmental, some curious, but most unwavering in their silent reproach, as if daring her to look them in the eyes and truly see the impact of her actions. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself surrounded by a small group of supporters who wanted to shake her hand or express their admiration for her strength, but she accepted their kindness with a gentle humility that seemed to only deepen their respect. Ethan stayed close, instinctively shielding her from the more aggressive reporters who shouted intrusive questions about how she felt or what she planned to do next. Mia, ever the vigilant journalist, hovered nearby, taking notes and capturing the nuanced reactions of the onlookers, her instincts telling her that the story had only just begun to reveal its deeper layers. As Jenna led Karen toward the waiting black SUV with tinted windows, the murmurs of disdain grew louder, and someone from the back of the crowd shouted, "Fake apology!" The words cut through the air like a shard of ice, and Karen flinched, her mask of composure cracking for just a moment as she hurried into the car. Jenna climbed in after her, slamming the door shut and immediately pulling out her phone to coordinate damage control. But Karen sat stiffly, her mind replaying the press conference over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every hitch in her voice that might have betrayed her guilt. As the SUV pulled away, Karen couldn't help but stare out the window at the airport receding in the distance, feeling as though she were leaving behind not just a place, but a version of herself that she didn't quite recognize anymore. A version that had been confident, assertive, and unyielding in her pursuit of maintaining order. Yet somehow that same resolute spirit had become the root of her undoing. The ache in her chest intensified as she thought about how quickly her life had unraveled, how a single moment of dismissiveness had turned her from an authoritative leader to a pariah. She couldn't understand how it had come to this, how adhering to protocol had led her to humiliate an elderly woman, and how that humiliation had transformed her into a symbol of callousness in the eyes of the public. Jenna was barking orders into the phone, demanding that the social media team double down on the narrative of protocol enforcement gone wrong, while ensuring that the airline's statement remained empathetic without outright admitting fault. Karen could barely process the words, her thoughts too tangled with shame and disbelief to focus on strategy. She wanted to protest, to explain that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that she was simply following guidelines and trying to keep the cabin orderly. But deep down, a gnawing doubt gnawed at her defenses, forcing her to confront a truth she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. Maybe it wasn't just protocol that had guided her actions. Maybe it had been something uglier, something insidious that had taken root long before that fateful flight. Back at the airport, Ethan and Eleanor made their way to a quieter area where airport security had cordoned off a space for them to regroup away from the chaos. Mia approached cautiously, sensing that both of them needed a moment to breathe after the emotional intensity of the press conference. "You were incredible out there," she said, offering a small but sincere smile. Ethan nodded, his jaw still clenched with residual frustration. "I just couldn't stand there and let them try to spin it like it was a one-time mistake," he replied, his voice low but charged with determination. People deserve to know that this isn't just about one person being mistreated. It's about a culture that allows that kind of behavior to thrive. Eleanor gave him a gentle pat on the arm, her eyes warm with gratitude. "You did right by speaking up," she said softly. "Sometimes silence only lets injustice keep its hold. You gave a voice to everyone who's ever felt overlooked and dismissed." Mia's eyes softened, and she couldn't help but admire the way Ethan had channeled his anger into something constructive, using his own privilege to amplify Eleanor's experience rather than overshadow it. As the three of them shared a moment of quiet reflection, Chelsea reappeared with a wide-eyed expression, her phone held out as she approached. "You're trending again," she informed them, showing a viral clip of Ethan's passionate response to Karen's apology. "People are calling you a hero, saying you did what needed to be done." Ethan looked mildly uncomfortable at the praise, shrugging it off with a slight grimace. "I'm not a hero," he insisted. "I just did what anyone should have done." Eleanor chuckled softly, giving him a knowing look. "Not everyone has the courage to stand up when it counts," she remarked. "You did something important today, even if it feels overwhelming." Mia glanced at her phone as well, noticing that various advocacy groups and civil rights organizations were already mobilizing around the incident, using it as a platform to demand better treatment for marginalized passengers and more comprehensive diversity training for airline staff. The momentum was undeniable, and Mia knew that the story was far from over. If anything, it was evolving into a larger conversation about systemic inequality and how power dynamics shaped every aspect of public service. Just then, Ethan's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Mom?" he said, his tone softening as he heard her voice on the other end. "Yeah, I'm okay. No, I wasn't hurt. It just happened so fast." As he reassured her, Mia and Eleanor exchanged a small, amused smile, recognizing that Ethan's fierce spirit of justice clearly came from a place of deep compassion, even if he didn't always know how to express it. After hanging up, he glanced at Mia and shrugged. "She saw it in the news," he explained. "Worried I'd gotten myself into trouble." Mia grinned. "Sounds like she knows you pretty well," she teased. Ethan gave a sheepish laugh, his tension finally easing a bit. "She always said I couldn't keep my mouth shut when something didn't sit right with me," he admitted. Guess she was right. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd outside the press conference area gradually dispersed, the three of them found a quiet cafe within the terminal where they could finally sit down and decompress. As they sipped their drinks, Mia couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for having been part of something that genuinely mattered, a story that had the potential to change how people thought about dignity and respect. Eleanor, despite the fatigue etched into her features, remained graceful and composed, her heart filled with an unexpected sense of peace. She had never intended to become a symbol of resilience or an advocate for change. But now that fate had thrust her into the spotlight, she found herself embracing the role with a quiet determination. She mused, stirring her tea thoughtfully, I never thought that one simple request for water could make such a difference. Sometimes it feels like the world doesn't see you until you're forced to stand up and make them look. Ethan nodded, his gaze intense yet gentle. People don't change because they're comfortable, he said. They change when they're confronted with the truth, when they can't ignore it anymore. Mia raised her cup in a mock toast. Here's to making them look, she said, her eyes alight with newfound purpose. And as they sat together, surrounded by the hum of travelers and the distant roar of jet engines, they knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would push them all to challenge the norms they had long accepted, and to keep fighting for a world where dignity was not a privilege, but a right that belonged to everyone, regardless of where they sat on a plane, or who they were perceived to be. As the days stretched on and the media storm only grew more intense, Karen found herself pulled deeper into a whirlwind of public outrage and relentless scrutiny that seemed intent on dismantling her life piece by piece. The internet had transformed her into a villain overnight, a symbol of entrenched bias and callous disregard. And despite Jenna's best efforts to control the damage, it was clear that the public's anger was not going to be placated by a single statement or a hastily arranged press conference. Headlines painted her as a monster, op-eds dissected her behavior with clinical precision, and social media was awash with hashtags calling for her termination, public apologies, and even criminal charges, as if denying Eleanor a glass of water were an unforgivable sin that represented everything wrong with society. Karen couldn't sleep. Her mind was trapped in an endless loop of replaying the incident, trying to remember every word, every glance, every choice that led her to this ruinous moment. The realization that her actions had become a cultural flashpoint was suffocating, and no matter how she tried to justify it to herself, protocol, procedure, efficiency, none of it could withstand the truth that stared back at her from every angry comment and news clip. Her family refused to take her calls, not wanting to be dragged into the controversy, and her neighbors whispered as she passed by, some even crossing the street to avoid her, as if her very presence were somehow contaminating. Jenna continued to insist that this would blow over, that news cycles moved fast, and something new would soon take the public's attention away from her, but Karen didn't believe it. The anger felt personal, visceral, as if people had been waiting for someone like her to make a mistake, just so they could tear her apart. One evening, exhausted from dodging reporters who had stationed themselves outside her apartment complex, Karen finally collapsed onto her couch and turned on the news, only to see a segment about Eleanor's upcoming appearance on a national talk show, where she was being hailed as a symbol of quiet dignity and resilience in the face of adversity. Karen's stomach twisted as she watched Eleanor speak with grace and humility, never once condemning Karen outright, but simply expressing hope that the airline would learn to treat all passengers with equal respect and compassion. Ethan sat beside her, offering his unwavering support and recounting how the public outcry had led to increased calls for reform within the airline industry. Karen couldn't help but feel a bitter pang of jealousy. Why was Eleanor being celebrated while she was being vilified? Hadn't she spent years trying to maintain order, ensuring that passengers were safe and comfortable? How had one mistake undone everything she had built, reducing her to nothing more than a scapegoat for a system that demanded efficiency over humanity? The next morning, Jenna called with unexpected news. Karen's presence was being requested at the very same talk show where Eleanor would be making her appearance. The producers wanted a reconciliation moment, a chance for Karen to publicly apologize and perhaps redeem herself. Karen's gut reaction was to refuse. to hide away and hope the storm would pass without her having to endure more public humiliation, but Jenna was insistent. "This is your chance," Jenna urged, her tone firm but sympathetic. "If you don't show that you're willing to take responsibility and learn from this, your career is over. The airline will have no choice but to fire you. But if you make people see you as human, just one flawed person who made a mistake, they might soften. You might even find support." Reluctantly, Karen agreed, though the thought of facing Eleanor in front of millions of viewers made her palms sweat and her heart race. On the day of the show, she dressed conservatively, choosing muted colors and minimal makeup, hoping to project humility and regret rather than the composed professionalism that had once been her armor. Jenna prepped her with talking points, emphasizing the importance of expressing genuine remorse rather than trying to justify her actions. But no matter how much they rehearsed, Karen couldn't shake the dread gnawing at her insides. When she arrived at the studio, the atmosphere was tense, with staff members giving her cold, assessing looks, clearly aware of who she was and why she was there. The producers greeted her politely but kept their distance, and Karen found herself isolated in a small green room, waiting for her turn to face the public's judgment. She could hear the muffled applause as Eleanor took the stage, the host warmly introducing her and recounting the incident with sympathetic overtones. Karen squeezed her hands together until her knuckles turned white, struggling to control her breathing as fear threatened to swallow her whole. When it was finally time, Karen was led onto the stage, and the audience's reaction was a mix of uneasy silence and scattered murmurs, as if they weren't sure whether to boo or simply observe. Eleanor was seated across from her, and when their eyes met, Karen felt a jolt of something indescribable. Shame, guilt, and a longing to understand how this woman could maintain such grace despite everything that had happened. The host began by summarizing the backlash Karen had faced, the petitions demanding her removal, and the airline's internal investigation. Karen swallowed hard, nodding in acknowledgement, her mind racing to remember Jenna's instructions. Be humble, be honest, be contrite. When asked about the incident, Karen took a shaky breath and forced herself to meet Eleanor's eyes. "There's no excuse for what I did," she began, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "I let my sense of duty and efficiency override basic compassion, and I failed to see you as a human being who just needed help. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that moment and realizing that it wasn't just about protocol or procedure. It was about my own biases, my own tendency to dismiss what seemed inconvenient or disruptive. And for that, I am truly, deeply sorry." The silence that followed was almost suffocating, and Karen braced herself for anger, for accusations, for anything that would solidify her downfall, but instead, Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Acknowledging the mistake is the first step," Eleanor said softly, her tone devoid of malice. "But moving forward means changing how we see each other. Not as problems to solve, but as people deserving of dignity and respect." The audience seemed to collectively exhale as if they had been holding their breath, waiting for the moment of reconciliation. The host guided the conversation toward the systemic issues that had come to light in the wake of the incident, discussing the airline's new training initiatives and the push for policy changes that would ensure passengers' basic needs were met, regardless of cabin class. Karen could hardly believe it. Rather than grilling her mercilessly, the host was focusing on solutions and the potential for positive change. When the segment ended, Eleanor extended her hand, and Karen hesitated for a moment before grasping it, surprised by the warmth in Eleanor's touch. "We can do better," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes filled with an understanding that Karen hadn't expected. "We can learn from this, but only if we're willing to listen." Karen nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Not because her problems had magically disappeared, but because she had finally allowed herself to be vulnerable and honest. As they left the stage, Jenna met Karen backstage with a cautious smile, clearly relieved that the appearance hadn't turned into a disaster. You did well, Jenna said, squeezing Karen's shoulder. People might actually start seeing you differently now. Outside the studio, a small group of supporters had gathered, offering words of encouragement and expressing their hope that Karen's willingness to change would inspire others to do the same. For the first time in weeks, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps not all was lost, and maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild from this shattered place, not just as a professional, but as a human being willing to confront her own flaws and grow from them. As she climbed into the car that would take her back to her apartment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the tension that had gripped her for so long finally loosening its hold. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start, and Karen knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time she was ready to walk it with humility and purpose. In the aftermath of that heartfelt and unexpectedly graceful television appearance, Karen found herself thrust into a surreal limbo between redemption and lingering condemnation. A space where the echoes of her mistakes were still loud enough to keep her awake at night, but just quiet enough to let a sliver of hope break through. The public response had been both merciful and ruthless. Some viewers were moved by her genuine remorse, cautiously willing to see her as a flawed human being capable of change, rather than a one-dimensional villain. Others, however, remained unyielding, convinced that her apology was nothing more than an orchestrated attempt at damage control. Headlines dissected every nuance of her demeanor. Social media continued to bristle with both vitriol and cautious support, and her phone remained a battleground between reporters demanding exclusive interviews and well-meaning acquaintances, trying to check on her well-being. Despite Jenna's reassurances that public sentiment was slowly shifting in her favor, Karen still couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that forgiveness might always be just out of reach, that her actions had left a stain too deep to be washed away with words. No matter how sincere. In the days following the talk show appearance, she tried to resume some semblance of normalcy, though normal no longer felt like something attainable. Returning to work was a daunting prospect, not just because of the backlash, but because she wasn't sure how her colleagues would receive her, whether they would look at her with sympathy, judgment, or cold indifference. Nevertheless, Karen knew she couldn't continue hiding, and when the call finally came from her supervisor inviting her to a private meeting at the airline's headquarters, she steeled herself for whatever fate awaited her. Dressed in a simple navy blue dress and low heels, professional but unassuming, she walked into the modern glass building that had once felt like a monument to her success, but now loomed over her like an impassable fortress. Jenna accompanied her, offering quiet words of encouragement that Karen only half heard as anxiety coiled tight in her stomach. When they reached the top floor, they were greeted by Colin Shepard, the new director of operations who had taken over in the wake of the incident's fallout. A composed and serious man with graying hair and piercing blue eyes. He gestured for Karen to take a seat across from him at the long oak conference table, and she couldn't help but notice how stark and sterile the room felt. Like a courtroom where judgment was passed with neither warmth nor humanity. Jenna took a seat beside her, her presence a lifeline in the tension-charged air. Colin began with formalities, reciting policies and procedural expectations, and Karen braced herself for the inevitable declaration that her career was over. But then his tone softened just slightly as he leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, "we've spent the last few weeks conducting a thorough internal review. Not just of your actions that day, but of our entire customer service training program, and the culture we've cultivated among our flight crews. Your incident with Mrs. Washington wasn't an isolated event, and I'm sure you've seen the reports of other complaints surfacing since this all began. The truth is, we've been too focused on efficiency metrics and too lenient on the subtle biases that seep into how we serve different passengers. Your actions, while undeniably problematic, have forced us to confront deeper issues within our system. Karen nodded slowly, unsure where this was leading, her heart pounding with both dread and cautious hope. We've decided not to terminate your employment, Colin continued, and Karen barely restrained a gasp of relief, though she remained motionless, fearing that celebrating too soon might shatter the fragile moment. Instead, we're offering you the opportunity to take on a new role, if you're willing. We want you to spearhead a project to overhaul our customer service protocols, incorporating dignity-centered training that addresses not only basic needs but also unconscious biases. We believe your perspective, having lived through this controversy firsthand, will lend an authenticity that outside consultants couldn't provide. For a moment, Karen could hardly breathe, unsure if she had heard correctly. Jenna squeezed her arm gently, as if to remind her that this was real and not some fevered fantasy of redemption. I don't understand, Karen finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Why me? After everything that's happened? Colin's expression softened even more, and he gave a small nod. Because we believe in giving second chances when they're earned, he replied. And you've demonstrated a willingness to confront your mistakes publicly, to own them without excuse. That's something we can work with. Plus, we need someone who truly understands how damaging those lapses in empathy can be. You can help us build something better if you're willing to take on the challenge. Karen swallowed hard, a surge of emotion welling up that she fought to keep in check. Yes, she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke more firmly. Yes, I would be honored to take on that responsibility. Colin nodded approvingly and went on to outline the details, how she would work closely with diversity experts, psychologists specializing in bias training, and even members of the advocacy groups that had arisen in the wake of Eleanor Washington's story. It was daunting, overwhelming even, but for the first time in weeks, Karen felt something flicker to life inside her that she had thought long extinguished. Purpose. As the meeting concluded and she left the building with Jenna at her side, the gravity of the opportunity finally settled in. Jenna, for her part, looked as if she were trying not to burst with pride, but Karen couldn't help but feel a deep, cautious humility. Redemption wouldn't be granted just because she took this new role. It would have to be earned every single day through hard work and unwavering commitment to change. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, poring over research articles Jenna had sent her about bias reduction strategies and the psychological impact of microaggressions. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages, some supportive, some still dripping with contempt. But she ignored them all, immersing herself in the task at hand. As the clock ticked past midnight, Karen realized that this work was not just about saving her career. It was about fundamentally reshaping who she was, about proving to herself that growth was not just a hollow promise, but a lived reality. The next day, she reached out to Eleanor Washington, hesitantly dialing the number Jenna had acquired through official channels, unsure if the older woman would even be willing to speak with her. To her surprise, Eleanor picked up after just a few rings, her voice warm and steady. Karen hesitated, her mouth dry, but forced herself to speak. Mrs. Washington, she began, I just wanted to thank you. I know I hurt you, and I can never take that back. But because of you, I have a chance to make things right. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever felt invisible. I want you to know that I'm not just saying this. I'm committed to real change. And I would be grateful if you would consider sharing your insights with me as we develop these new protocols. There was a long pause, and Karen feared she had overstepped. But then Eleanor's gentle laugh came through the line. You know, child, Eleanor said, people don't change by wishing they were different. They change by doing the work. If you're serious about this, I'll help you. Not because I owe you anything, but because I believe that people can learn if they're willing. You've got a long road ahead, but it sounds like you've started walking it. That's something. Relief flooded through Karen, and they spoke for nearly an hour, discussing ideas, perspectives, and the kinds of training that might actually make a difference. When they finally hung up, Karen felt both exhausted and invigorated, realizing that the real work was just beginning. She knew she wouldn't always get it right, that some would never forgive her, and that doubt would shadow her steps for a long time. But at least now she was moving forward, determined to transform her failure into a foundation for something better, something lasting. As dawn broke over the city, Karen allowed herself a small, tentative smile, knowing that rebuilding herself from the ground up would be painful and slow, but also knowing that it was worth every step. A year had passed since that fateful flight, and in that time, the world had shifted in ways that Karen Whitmore could never have imagined, both personally and professionally. The airline industry had been irrevocably transformed, and much of that change bore her fingerprints, woven together with the courage of Eleanor Washington and the relentless advocacy of people who once saw her as an emblem of all that was wrong. It was a warm spring afternoon when Karen found herself standing at the entrance of a large modern conference center, clutching a small stack of notes even though she had rehearsed her speech 100 times over. The place was buzzing with energy. Industry leaders and flight attendants from around the globe gathered for the International Conference on Service Equity and Human Dignity. The banner hanging above the entrance proudly declared, "Redefining Dignity in the Service Industry, a Global Conversation." And just seeing it sent a wave of apprehension coursing through her veins. There were reporters in clusters, cameras at the ready, and she could already sense that some were there not to celebrate progress but to scrutinize every word she would utter, waiting for any sign of weakness or hypocrisy. Her stomach churned, but she took a deep breath and forced herself to walk forward, head high and shoulders squared, remembering Eleanor's advice to stand in her truth, regardless of how others perceived it. Jenna was beside her, ever the steadfast friend and advisor, giving her a reassuring nod before whispering, "You've got this. You've earned your place here." As they made their way through the bustling corridors, Karen couldn't help but notice the diversity of faces. People from various backgrounds, dressed in uniforms from airlines spanning continents, executives in tailored suits, activists with earnest expressions, and educators from universities seeking to integrate empathy training into their curricula. There were even flight attendants wearing pins that said "Dignity First," with a small water droplet logo. A subtle nod to the incident that had sparked a movement. Karen felt a pang of both guilt and pride, knowing that she had been the catalyst, both the villain and the vessel through which progress had been painfully birthed. She passed a large digital display playing highlights from the conference's opening ceremony. Images of Eleanor speaking the day before, her commanding presence drawing both tears and applause, followed by clips of Carson and Marissa discussing the new training programs that had swept the industry, transforming the way service was approached from the ground up. It was surreal to think of how far they had come. And yet Karen couldn't help but feel a gnawing fear that she didn't truly belong among them. That despite her dedication, her work, and her public penance, she would always be seen as the woman who once denied water to an elderly passenger. They approached the main auditorium, and Karen's name flashed on the digital schedule beside the words, "Keynote Address Moving from Failure to Change." Just seeing it made her throat tighten. She wanted to run, to escape from the weight of it all, but instead, she straightened her spine and took a deep breath, glancing over at Jenna, who gave her an encouraging smile. As they reached the backstage area, a familiar figure stood waiting. Gabriel Chen, now a prominent civil rights advocate, his journey having taken as many unexpected turns as hers. He offered her a warm handshake and a smile, his presence both comforting and challenging. "Ready to change the world again?" he teased, and Karen managed a small laugh despite her nerves. "I'm just trying not to trip on stage," she replied, and he gave her a knowing look. "You'll be great. Just speak from your heart. No one can take that from you, he said, and his words settled something deep inside her. Moments later, the stage manager gestured for her to take her place, and as Karen stepped into the blinding lights, the murmur of the audience quieted, leaving a pregnant silence hanging in the air. She paused, allowing herself a moment to feel the energy in the room, then leaned into the microphone. A year ago, I made a mistake, one that wasn't just an error of judgment, but a reflection of deeper flaws in how I viewed service and humanity. It's taken me a long time to face that truth without flinching, to understand that my failure wasn't just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a system that has subtly taught me to prioritize some lives over others. When I denied Mrs. Washington a simple cup of water, I wasn't just failing as a flight attendant. I was failing as a human being. And when that realization hit me, it felt like the world caved in around me and I didn't know how to rebuild. But I've learned something crucial over the past year. Change doesn't start when you're forgiven. It starts when you decide to forgive yourself enough to get up and do better. The room remained silent, every gaze fixed on her, and Karen steadied her voice, willing her hands not to tremble. I was given a second chance, not just by my employer, but by people I had wronged, by Mrs. Washington, by my colleagues, by the passengers who put their trust in me. And that second chance came with a responsibility to do more than just apologize. I had to confront the reality that I wasn't alone in my failure, that the entire industry was built on a hierarchy that dehumanized those who didn't fit the mold of privilege and wealth. So we set out to change that, to rewrite the way we train, to dismantle biases we didn't even realize we held, to create a culture where dignity isn't treated as a luxury reserved for those who can afford it. And we're not done. Change is a process, not a destination. We are still learning, still evolving, still challenging the norms that made my mistake possible. I'm not here to tell you that we've fixed everything, but I am here to say that we are committed to never looking away from the uncomfortable truths that we've uncovered. A slow, steady wave of applause began, and Karen felt her heart swell with both relief and gratitude. She took a deep breath, allowing the sound to wash over her, then continued. I stand here today not as a reformed leader or a perfect advocate, but as a person who chose not to let failure define me. I chose to learn, to grow, and to invite others into that journey. I want to thank Mrs. Washington, who taught me that forgiveness doesn't erase mistakes, but makes space for redemption. I want to thank my colleagues who held me accountable when I wanted to hide. And I want to thank every single one of you for being here today, for committing to this work even when it's messy and painful and complicated. Together, we're changing an industry that desperately needed to remember that service means more than efficiency. It means humanity. As she stepped back from the microphone, the applause erupted into a standing ovation, and Karen felt her vision blur with tears, not from sadness, but from the profound realization that she had not just been given a second chance. She had built it, brick by brick, out of humility, accountability, and relentless determination to become a person worthy of trust. As she left the stage, Gabriel met her with a proud nod, and Jenna wrapped her in a tight hug, whispering, "You did it." In the crowd, Karen spotted Eleanor Washington, dignified and gracious as always, giving her a warm smile and a gentle nod. In that moment, Karen knew that the real work was just beginning, but she also knew that she would not face it alone. She had turned her deepest shame into a foundation for something greater, and though the path ahead would always have obstacles, she no longer feared them, because she had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to keep walking despite it. The lesson in this story is that dignity and humanity should never be conditional or negotiable, regardless of status, race, age, or social standing. It teaches us that small acts of indifference or discrimination, though seemingly insignificant, can hold immense power to harm and dehumanize, while acts of courage and compassion, even from unexpected places, can spark transformative change. Through Eleanor's quiet strength and Karen's eventual redemption, the story highlights the importance of self reflection and accountability, reminding us that genuine growth often comes from confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we support. It also emphasizes that mistakes do not define a person if they choose to learn and change, and that redemption is possible when one takes responsibility and commits to making a positive impact. Furthermore, the story challenges societal norms that prioritize efficiency over humanity, urging institutions to place dignity at the heart of their practices. At its core, this story is a call to action, urging everyone, whether in positions of power or as everyday citizens, to choose kindness, recognize inherent worth, and actively challenge injustices, big or small. In the end, it reminds us that humanity thrives not through perfection, but through the unwavering commitment to treat one another with respect and compassion. In a world where a single moment can spark a movement, where one mistake can unravel hidden truths and ignite a wave of change, a quiet but fierce revolution was born at 37,000 feet. It began with a simple need, a cup of water, and a cruel denial that echoed through the corridors of human decency, forcing long-buried injustices into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Eleanor Washington, a 76-year-old black woman with dignity etched into every line of her weathered face, became an unexpected symbol of resistance when a flight attendant named Karen Whitmore refused her water for medication on a transatlantic flight. What should have been a moment of compassion instead transformed into a global reckoning about dignity, bias, and the power of everyday actions. From that fateful flight to the sweeping changes that followed, the story became a battle not only for respect, but for humanity itself, uniting unlikely allies, toppling systems rooted in discrimination, and teaching the world that silence is not an option when human dignity is on the line. In this story of redemption, resistance, and reconciliation, lives would be changed, hearts would be tested, and a single act of injustice would unfold into a journey toward a better, more compassionate world. Eleanor Hamilton adjusted her floral scarf, a gentle breeze lifting the edge of it as she clutched her leather handbag and approached the bustling airport terminal. At 80 years old, she moved with a deliberate grace, each step a quiet testament to decades of endurance and quiet strength. Today was a special day, a day she'd been dreaming about for months. Flying from New York to London to witness her great-grandson, Joshua, graduate with honors from Oxford University. A master's degree in astrophysics, no less. Her heart swelled with pride, thinking about how far their family had come, from her great-grandfather's hands roughened from picking cotton in Georgia to Joshua, a young black scholar whose intellect had pierced through the very heavens. She knew Joshua's late grandfather, William, a Korean War veteran who had fought fiercely for his family's dignity and opportunities, would have beamed with pride, his spirit woven into the fabric of every accomplishment that young man achieved. Eleanor moved steadily through the airport, aware of the curious glances she sometimes received as an elderly woman traveling alone, her back straight, her chin lifted, and her spirit unbowed, despite the complaints from her arthritis that gnawed at her knees. She wore her Sunday best, a pale blue dress with embroidered flowers along the hem and her pearl earrings. William's last gift to her before he passed. A kind TSA agent helped her lift her modest luggage onto the conveyor belt, nodding respectfully as she offered him a grateful smile. Eleanor passed through security without incident and made her way to Gate 17, where a sea of anxious travelers already gathered, their phones lighting up like fireflies as they scrolled through messages and news feeds. She found a seat near the window, resting her cane beside her, and took out her worn, leather-bound journal, a gift from her daughter Margaret on her 70th birthday. Inside were notes and memories of William, cherished quotes from Maya Angelou, and dreams scribbled in the slanted cursive that her hands could still muster despite the tremors that sometimes betrayed her aging fingers. Her thoughts wandered to Joshua again, the image of him in his cap and gown so vivid it made her eyes glisten. As she sat, the airline crew began their pre-boarding announcements, and Eleanor took a moment to sip from her water bottle, remembering her doctor's stern warning about staying hydrated. Dr. Lawson had been firm, reminding her that with her heart medication, dehydration could be dangerous. "Even if you don't feel thirsty, drink," he had said. She nodded at the memory and took another sip. The boarding process began with the usual chaos. First-class passengers sweeping through, business class next, and then the long-suffering economy crowd inching forward. Eleanor's seat was 38C, an aisle seat she had specifically chosen for the legroom and easy access. She knew long flights tended to swell her ankles, and the last thing she needed was to feel trapped in the middle or against the window. A young man with disheveled hair and a tattoo peeking out from his sleeve plopped into the middle seat beside her, barely glancing her way as his headphones blasted some kind of heavy metal that thumped loudly enough for Eleanor to feel the beat. She gave him a polite nod, though he didn't seem to notice, absorbed in his own world, and she leaned back, clutching her handbag in her lap, and murmuring a small prayer for a safe flight. The last of the passengers boarded, and the flight attendants, led by the stern and immaculately groomed Travis Miller, moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and scolding a mother whose toddler refused to stay seated. Travis's face never softened, his eyes sharp and efficient, as if each passenger were a problem he had to manage rather than a person deserving of care. His counterpart, Karen Monroe, stood near the front, discussing service procedures with Rachel Collins, the youngest flight attendant on the team, whose nervousness was betrayed by how often she adjusted her uniform. Eleanor couldn't help but smile gently when Rachel caught her eye and gave a small wave. Once the plane leveled off, the lights dimmed, signaling the start of the long transatlantic journey. Eleanor settled back, clutching her journal, her mind still with Joshua and the pride that blossomed in her chest like magnolia flowers after a rainstorm. About 2 hours in, the dry recycled air of the cabin left Eleanor's mouth parched, and she reached for the small service button above her head, pressing it gently. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, but still, no response. Realizing it was probably broken, she turned to her seatmate, but the young man remained engrossed in his music, oblivious to her quiet discomfort. Determined, Eleanor adjusted her scarf and carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, using her cane to steady herself as she rose. Her body protested, joints creaking like old hinges. But she moved with purpose down the narrow aisle toward the back galley where she had spotted Karen and Travis earlier. The plane gave a small shudder of turbulence, but Eleanor remained steady, navigating through the maze of feet and bags sticking out from the rows. When she reached the galley, she found Travis leaning against the counter, flipping through some paperwork, while Karen poured herself a cup of coffee, not bothering to hide her irritation when Eleanor appeared. "Excuse me," Eleanor began, her voice steady but soft, carrying the warmth of a Georgia upbringing. "My service button isn't working, and I'd appreciate a small cup of water for my medication." Travis barely glanced at her, as if even acknowledging her presence was a chore, before speaking in a clipped tone. "The beverage service will start shortly, ma'am. Please return to your seat." "I understand, but my medication is time-sensitive," Eleanor insisted gently, her hands trembling slightly, whether from fatigue or frustration, she wasn't sure. "Just a little cup of water, if you wouldn't mind." Karen scoffed lightly, rolling her eyes as if Eleanor had asked for a 5-course meal. "We have a schedule to keep. If we start giving out water now, everyone will want something." Travis gave a curt nod, echoing her sentiment. "Rules are rules, ma'am. You'll have to wait." The dismissal was sharp and deliberate, like being turned away from a whites-only diner during the days of segregation. A familiar heat rose in Eleanor's chest, not just from indignation, but from the flood of memories. Countless times in her life when she'd been treated as invisible or unworthy. Her mouth was so dry it felt like dust coated her tongue, and the tightness in her chest made her wonder if it was her heart or just anger manifesting in a way that felt all too familiar. As she stood there, gathering herself to respond, a deep, confident voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Eleanor turned to see a tall, well-dressed man standing just behind her, his presence commanding the space without even trying. His voice was smooth but firm, carrying a distinct authority that demanded attention. Travis straightened, his demeanor shifting instantly from dismissive to cautious. "No problem, sir. We're just explaining that beverage service will start shortly." The man, Ethan Blake, though Eleanor didn't yet know his name, raised an eyebrow and glanced at the cup of coffee still steaming in Karen's hand. "Really?" "Because it looks like beverages are already being served." Karen stiffened, flushing with annoyance, but Ethan didn't give her a chance to speak. "This lady needs water for her medication. Surely a cup of water isn't too much to ask, is it?" His calm but pointed question seemed to cut through their practiced apathy. Without another word, Travis reached for a plastic cup, filled it from the water dispenser, and handed it to Eleanor without making eye contact. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, her dignity intact despite the slight. Ethan smiled warmly at her, his eyes kind, and gave her a small nod before turning his attention back to the attendants. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a measured seriousness, "basic courtesy shouldn't be negotiable. You might want to remember that." The hint of steel in his tone left both attendants momentarily speechless, and as Eleanor made her way back to her seat, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, mixed with a gratitude that made her chest ache. Behind her, Karen glared at Ethan, her frustration barely concealed, while Travis muttered something under his breath. Eleanor didn't hear it, and she didn't need to. All she knew was that in that moment, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and refused to let her be treated as invisible. Ethan Blake stood there in the narrow aisle, his towering presence effortlessly filling the small space between the galley and the rows of passengers. He was still watching Karen and Travis, his piercing gaze demanding more than just compliance. It demanded respect, not only for him but for Eleanor Hamilton and every other passenger that the two had clearly deemed unworthy of basic human decency. His broad shoulders, relaxed but poised, seemed to exude an authority that neither of the flight attendants could quite challenge. Behind them, Rachel Collins, the youngest of the crew, peeked around the corner, her eyes widening as she witnessed the unexpected confrontation. Ethan glanced over his shoulder at Eleanor, who was already shuffling back to her seat, clutching the small plastic cup of water as if it were a fragile piece of her dignity. Restored. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he let her retreat without further embarrassment, understanding instinctively that she had spent a lifetime carrying burdens just like this one. Burdens that most people couldn't even begin to fathom. He turned back to the flight attendants, his jaw set with a calm determination, his voice low but unwavering. "You might want to rethink how you treat your passengers," he said, his tone almost conversational but laced with an unmistakable challenge. "Especially the elderly. You wouldn't want the airline to face a PR nightmare because of a lack of basic human decency, now would you?" Karen looked like she wanted to retort, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But Travis stepped in, his tone falsely conciliatory. "Sir, we're just following protocol. There's a service order to maintain, and we can't just hand out drinks willy-nilly. It causes disruptions." Ethan gave him a look that could have frozen Liva. "Protocol doesn't override humanity," he replied evenly. "And if you're so worried about disruptions, maybe start by not creating them yourself." His words hung in the air, and for a moment Karen and Travis simply stood there, dumbfounded, as Ethan gave them one last look of disapproval before he turned and walked back to his seat in first class. As he moved down the aisle, he could feel the eyes of other passengers following him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. A few gave him appreciative nods, and one older woman whispered, "Good for you," as he passed by. Ethan gave her a small smile in return, not because he enjoyed the attention, but because he knew how necessary it was to break the silence that so often surrounded acts of quiet discrimination. When he settled back into his plush first-class seat, the leather soft against his shoulders, he glanced out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below, his mind still replaying the scene. He couldn't shake the way Eleanor had looked, standing there in her simple dress and scarf, her shoulders squared but her hands trembling just slightly as if her own determination were at war with the weight of years spent enduring similar slights. He had seen it before, in his mother's face, in his father's eyes. Those subtle, unspoken battles fought daily just to be seen, just to be treated with the respect every human deserved. He sighed, rubbing his temple as he pulled out his phone to check his messages. A text from his assistant flashed on the screen. "Board meeting confirmed for Monday. Need final sign-off on merger proposal." Ethan's jaw tightened. The merger, a massive deal involving his motivational speaking brand, acquiring a well-known global leadership consulting firm, was supposed to be his crowning achievement. But at that moment, it felt trivial, insignificant compared to what he had just witnessed. He leaned back, forcing his thoughts back to the reason for his trip, delivering the keynote address at a global leadership summit in London. He'd planned to speak about resilience and personal growth, but the incident with Eleanor lingered like a thorn in his conscience, whispering that his words would ring hollow if he didn't confront the kind of everyday injustices that had just played out in front of him. While Ethan was lost in thought, the cabin buzzed with subdued conversations. A few rows back, Mia Chen, the investigative journalist, was typing furiously on her laptop, replaying the video she had discreetly recorded of the encounter. She knew a story when she saw one, and this one wasn't just about an old woman being denied water. It was about dignity and how easily it could be stripped away when people forgot to see each other as human. She leaned back, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, debating whether to upload the clip now or wait until they landed. Her instinct screamed to post it immediately, but her journalist's intuition urged her to dig deeper first. She glanced around, noticing the ripple effect that Ethan's intervention had created. Passengers were whispering to each other, some stealing glances at the galley, where Karen and Travis were still stiff with resentment. Rachel had returned to her duties but moved with a palpable tension, clearly shaken by the confrontation. Mia considered getting Ethan's side of the story but thought better of it. He didn't strike her as someone interested in the limelight, and besides, the raw power of the video spoke for itself. Instead, she opened a new document, her thoughts tumbling into words as she crafted an op-ed about how small acts of resistance could ripple into something much larger. Meanwhile, back in economy, Eleanor settled into her seat, the small cup of water already half empty, her hand still trembling slightly. She glanced at the young man beside her who remained oblivious, his music blaring loud enough to vibrate through his seat. She couldn't help but smile wryly at the contrast, how the young often moved through the world with blinders on, unaware of the quiet struggles unfolding right beside them. Eleanor took a slow breath, her thoughts drifting back to William, to his deep, rumbling laugh and the way he would have handled this. Head held high, a calm but unyielding demand for respect. A sudden pang of grief tightened her throat and she squeezed her eyes shut, letting memories of his warmth shield her from the bitterness still prickling at the edges of her heart. She opened her journal, flipping past familiar verses from Maya Angelou, and paused on a page where she had written one of her own reflections. "Dignity is not what they give you, it's what you refuse to let them take." Her hand traced the faded ink, and she let out a soft breath, wondering how many more years she would have to remind herself of that truth. Back in the galley, Karen and Travis whispered furiously, their anger palpable. "Who does he think he is?" Karen muttered, clenching her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles went white. "Some rich guy who thinks he can tell us how to do our jobs. I don't care how important he thinks he is, that old lady wasn't supposed to get special treatment." Travis nodded, trying to regain his composure, but his mind was racing. The tension in the cabin was undeniable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake, one far more significant than just bending the rules. Rachel approached cautiously, her eyes wary. Maybe we did go too far," she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen shot her a glare that could have cut steel. "You're too soft, Rachel. You'll never last if you keep coddling passengers. We follow procedures for a reason." Rachel looked away, but her conscience gnawed at her, making her stomach twist. She had seen Eleanor's face, the hurt, the exhaustion, and it haunted her, making her wonder if following the rules at the expense of compassion was truly the right path. As the flight continued, word of the confrontation spread like wildfire among the passengers. Whispers and sideways glances painted the air with tension, and Ethan could feel it even from the comfort of his first-class seat. He knew this wouldn't just blow over, not with how visibly upset some of the passengers still were. He made a mental note to follow up after the flight, knowing instinctively that moments like this could either fade away as another forgotten injustice or ignite something far greater. As he glanced out the window, his phone buzzed with notifications, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the quiet determination taking root in his gut. He wasn't just going to let this pass. He wasn't sure how or what he would do yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Change didn't happen by waiting for someone else to act. It happened when those who could make a difference refused to remain silent. With that thought firm in his mind, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, preparing for what would inevitably follow once they touched down. The flight continued its steady arc across the Atlantic, the hum of the engines merging with the soft murmur of conversations and the faint rustle of fabric as passengers shifted in their seats, some attempting to sleep while others lost themselves in the glowing screens embedded in the headrests before them. Ethan sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the window where a pale ribbon of dawn was just beginning to streak the horizon with a muted coral light. His mind a maelstrom of thought and reflection. In his career as a motivational speaker and corporate leader, he had often discussed courage and conviction, the power of standing up for one's principles even when it was inconvenient or risky. Yet somehow, as he thought about Eleanor and the quiet dignity with which she had borne the humiliation inflicted upon her, Ethan couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of inadequacy, as if his own speeches about integrity and resilience had always fallen just a little bit short of the raw, unpolished truth of real-life struggles. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his jacket, his mind replaying the moment when he had first heard Eleanor's soft, hesitant voice asking for water. How Karen had dismissed her with that curt, indifferent response, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be brushed aside. That singular act of disregard had ignited something primal within Ethan, a fire that had long lain dormant, smothered under years of corporate politeness and measured diplomacy. He knew what it felt like to be judged at a glance, to have his worth questioned by those who saw only the surface, and the realization that Eleanor, someone who had clearly endured a lifetime of being overlooked and diminished, had been treated that way in her most vulnerable moment, filled him with an unyielding resolve to make this right, no matter the consequences. He reached for his phone, scrolling absently through his contacts until his thumb hovered over the number of his publicist, Layla Sanderson, a shrewd and fiercely loyal woman who had guided his brand through more than a few storms. His instincts told him that this was more than just a personal outrage. This was a moment that demanded amplification, that needed to be seen and heard far beyond the confines of Flight 287. But as his finger hovered over the call button, He hesitated, torn between the impulse to act and the knowledge that once the story was out, it would become something far greater than himself, something he couldn't control. A movement caught his eye, and he glanced up to see Mia Chen walking down the aisle, her expression thoughtful and intense, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. She had that look in her eye, the one that signaled she was already writing the story in her head, piecing together the narrative that would undoubtedly go viral the moment it hit the internet. Ethan knew that look because he had seen it in his own eyes 1,000 times. Back when he was still building his career from the ground up, seizing every opportunity with relentless ambition. Mia caught his gaze, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She gave him a brief, respectful nod before continuing to the back of the plane, undoubtedly seeking more context, more voices to add depth to the story she was crafting. Meanwhile, in the galley, Karen and Travis were locked in a hushed argument, their voices sharp and tense despite their efforts to keep quiet. Karen was fuming, her cheeks flushed with indignation, while Travis seemed more anxious, constantly glancing around as if expecting someone to appear and reprimand them. "You didn't have to be so harsh," Travis muttered, wiping his hands on a towel that he twisted nervously between his fingers. "She was just an old lady needing water. We could have just given her a cup and been done with it." Karen glared at him, her voice a venomous whisper. "We have rules for a reason, Travis. If we start bending them for one person, it becomes chaos. And besides, she was being entitled. Just because she's old doesn't mean she gets to break the rules." Travis looked unconvinced, but he knew better than to openly challenge Karen. Her fierce ambition and reputation for ruthless efficiency had made her a formidable presence among the crew, and despite his reservations, he wasn't ready to risk his job by openly opposing her. "That guy in first class, he's going to make trouble," Travis said reluctantly, his eyes darting towards the front of the plane. Karen scoffed, folding her arms defensively. "Let him try. We did nothing wrong. Passengers always think they're entitled to special treatment. He doesn't scare me." But as Karen turned away, her confidence already faltering, she couldn't help but feel a chill crawling up her spine. The quiet way Ethan had confronted them, the unwavering steadiness in his gaze, had left her feeling unexpectedly vulnerable, as if he had seen right through her bravado to the insecurity lurking beneath. She had built her career on being tough, uncompromising, and fiercely by the book. But now, for the first time, she was questioning whether that approach had truly served her, or merely isolated her from the very people she was supposed to be serving. She glanced at Travis again, noticing his discomfort, and for a fleeting moment, an almost imperceptible pang of doubt crept into her thoughts. Before she could dwell on it, the cabin intercom chimed, and Captain Brennan's voice crackled through, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making good progress and should be landing in London on schedule. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, as we are experiencing light turbulence. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement seemed to momentarily dissipate the tension, but Karen knew it wouldn't last. Word was already spreading through the cabin, and she could sense the atmosphere shifting, a quiet rebellion brewing among the passengers, fueled by the simmering outrage of having witnessed Eleanor's treatment. Back in her seat, Eleanor clutched the small water cup, staring down at it as if it were some kind of alien artifact, her mind replaying the entire ordeal in painful detail. She had learned long ago not to make waves, not to draw attention to herself. An old survival instinct forged in the fires of discrimination and relentless judgment. But something about this moment, about being humiliated in front of so many strangers, had shaken her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She thought of her granddaughter Layla, with her bright eyes and fierce spirit, and wondered what the girl would say if she knew her grandmother had just endured another of life's endless injustices without fighting back. Eleanor's hands trembled, not from fear but from the simmering frustration of a lifetime spent swallowing her pride for the sake of keeping the peace. She wanted to be strong, to embody the resilience that her family always admired. But sometimes the weight of it all just became too much to bear. A gentle touch on her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see Rachel standing there, her face filled with an earnest sincerity that made Eleanor's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for what happened earlier," Rachel whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "That wasn't right, and you didn't deserve it. I wanted you to know that." Eleanor offered a small, grateful smile, patting Rachel's hand softly. "Thank you, dear. That means more than you know," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. As Rachel returned to her duties, the small gesture of kindness seemed to reignite something within Eleanor, a quiet resolve that had lain dormant under years of restraint. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop being so accommodating, to let the world see that her dignity wasn't just something to be dismissed on a whim. She sat up straighter, the tension in her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to feel a spark of righteous anger. Not an unkind anger, but the kind that reminded her she deserved respect, just like anyone else. And as the plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, the dawn breaking wider over the horizon, Eleanor Hamilton found herself holding onto that spark with a newfound determination. Unbeknownst to her, the story of what had happened was already taking on a life of its own, fueled by whispers, glances, and the quiet rumble of collective discontent that was gathering strength with every mile. Somewhere in the back of the plane, Mia Chen was typing furiously, her article already forming a powerful opening line. "What does it say about us when we deny an elderly woman a cup of water? It says more than we care to admit, and it's time to confront it." The words on her screen seemed to glow with purpose, and Mia knew that once the world heard about Eleanor Hamilton, they would have to confront the uncomfortable truth. That dignity should never be negotiable, no matter the circumstances, no matter the rules. The atmosphere on Flight 287 had shifted, an unspoken tension simmering just beneath the surface as whispers rippled through the cabin like waves caught in a storm. Ethan could feel it, that familiar swell of anticipation when something monumental was about to unfold, like standing on the edge of a great precipice, knowing that once you stepped off, there was no going back. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was one of those rare defining moments when doing nothing would be just as harmful as doing the wrong thing, and so, driven by that relentless moral impulse that had guided him through countless public speaking engagements and leadership seminars, he made his decision. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, he pushed himself out of his seat, determination hardening his features as he strode purposefully down the aisle, each step fueled by a deep-seated conviction that this couldn't be allowed to stand unchallenged. Passengers glanced at him as he passed, their faces reflecting a curious mix of apprehension and interest, as if they too sensed that whatever was about to happen would either shatter the uneasy calm or solidify it into something far worse. Complacency. As he reached the galley where Karen and Travis were engaged in a hushed but heated exchange, he cleared his throat loudly enough to capture their attention, and when they turned to face him, he could see the flicker of irritation in Karen's eyes, quickly masked by a cold, professional veneer. "Excuse me," Ethan began, his tone firm yet controlled, his eyes never leaving Karen's. "I need to speak with you about what just happened with Mrs. Hamilton." Karen straightened, lifting her chin with that familiar air of superiority, while Travis looked distinctly uncomfortable, his gaze flickering nervously between his colleague and the determined passenger before them. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier, we have a schedule for beverage service, and it applies to all passengers equally," Karen stated, her voice clipped and precise, clearly trying to regain control of the situation by asserting the authority she so desperately clung to. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't even blink, his stance unwavering as he crossed his arms over his chest, forcing Karen to maintain eye contact despite her instinctive urge to look away. "I don't think you understand," he replied, his tone cutting through her practiced professionalism like a knife through silk. "This isn't about beverage service or protocol. This is about basic human decency. Mrs. Hamilton needed water to take her medication, and instead of showing compassion, you dismissed her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. You humiliated her in front of everyone, and it was completely unacceptable. Karen bristled, her jaw tightening as she fought to maintain her composure, but Ethan didn't relent, pushing forward with the same unyielding force that had made him a sought-after speaker on integrity and leadership. "People are watching, Karen," he continued, his voice growing softer but no less intense. "They're watching how you treat the vulnerable, how you respond when someone needs help, and they're seeing that you'd rather cling to your rules than extend a single ounce of kindness. Is that really how you want to be remembered when this plane lands? As the flight attendant who couldn't find it in her heart to give an old woman a cup of water?" For a moment, Karen looked as though she might snap back with a cutting retort, but something in Ethan's tone, a quiet, unwavering conviction that made it clear he wouldn't back down, seemed to cut through her defenses, and a flicker of uncertainty crept into her eyes. "Sir," she began, attempting to regain her footing, "we have protocols for a reason. If we make exceptions—" "Stop hiding behind protocols," Ethan interrupted, his voice never rising but growing sharper, more pointed, like a spear thrust directly at her pride. "Protocols are there to ensure safety and efficiency, not to justify cruelty. If you've forgotten that, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Travis visibly flinched at Ethan's words, clearly torn between his loyalty to his colleague and the undeniable truth being laid bare before him. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could find the words, another voice cut through the tension, a calm, authoritative tone that immediately commanded respect. "Is there an issue here?" Captain Brennan stood at the entrance to the galley, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the scene before him, clearly picking up on the tension radiating between Karen and Ethan. Karen straightened instantly, the mask of professionalism snapping back into place like armor, and she offered a tight-lipped smile. "Just a minor misunderstanding, Captain," she replied, her tone light but strained. Ethan, however, wasn't about to let her dismiss the situation so easily. "Actually, Captain," he said, turning to face the pilot with a calm but unyielding expression, "this is more than just a misunderstanding. One of your flight attendants refused to give an elderly passenger water for her medication, citing protocol as the reason. It was demeaning, unnecessary, and frankly, a gross misuse of authority." Captain Brennan's face tightened, his expression shifting from curiosity to displeasure as he glanced between Ethan and Karen. "Is that true?" he asked, directing his question at Karen, who hesitated, clearly caught between the instinct to defend herself and the dawning realization that her actions might have consequences after all. "Sir, we have a schedule for beverage service, and I was simply following—" "That's not what I asked," Brennan interrupted, his voice firm and unyielding. "Did you refuse an elderly passenger water for her medication?" Karen faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line, and for the first time a hint of vulnerability crept into her demeanor. I was following the protocol, sir," she muttered, but even to her own ears the excuse sounded flimsy, hollow. Brennan exhaled slowly, clearly displeased, and turned to Ethan. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said with a nod, then fixed Karen with a stern glare. "We'll be discussing this further once we land. In the meantime, see to it that the passenger receives whatever assistance she needs. Understood?" Karen's cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, but she managed a stiff nod. "Yes, Captain," she replied, though her tone lacked any real contrition. Ethan gave Brennan a respectful nod before turning and heading back to his seat, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins as he processed what had just transpired. He knew he had made the right choice in confronting Karen, but there was still a heaviness in his chest, a lingering sense of discomfort at how easily someone's dignity could be stripped away under the guise of following protocol. As he settled back into his seat, Ethan couldn't help but notice how the other passengers were watching him now, some offering discreet nods of approval, others whispering to one another in hushed tones. Mia Chen appeared at his side, her expression thoughtful, and she gave him a small, appreciative smile. "That was brave," she said softly, and Ethan merely shrugged, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't about bravery," he replied after a moment, his gaze drifting back to where Eleanor sat, still cradling the small cup of water as if it were something precious. "It was about doing what was right." Mia gave him a long, considering look, as if trying to decipher the layers of motivation that had driven him to act. But before she could respond, another figure appeared beside them. Rachel, her face pale and eyes wide. "They're talking about it on social media," she whispered, urgently, showing them her phone, where a hastily recorded video of the confrontation had already begun circulating. Ethan felt a pang of unease. He hadn't intended for this to become a spectacle, hadn't wanted to make himself the focal point of a controversy. But as he scanned the rapidly increasing number of comments ranging from outrage at Karen's actions to support for his intervention, he realized that the story had already taken on a life of its own, spiraling out of control in the digital ether, where narratives twisted and transformed at lightning speed. Taking a deep breath, he glanced at Mia, who was already typing furiously on her phone, clearly preparing to shape the unfolding story with the nuance and clarity it deserved. Ethan knew that this was just the beginning, that once they landed, the consequences of his actions, and Karen's, would reverberate far beyond the confines of this plane. As he glanced back one last time at Eleanor, who sat quietly, her expression both weary and resolute, Ethan knew that no matter what came next, he would stand by his decision to speak up, because silence in the face of injustice was never an option. Not for him, and certainly not for those who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. As Flight 287 began its descent toward Chicago O'Hare, the tension that had rippled through the cabin earlier seemed to have condensed into a dense electric charge, making the air feel heavy with the unspoken consequences of what had just transpired. Ethan glanced out the window at the sprawling cityscape below, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, knowing that whatever awaited them on the ground would undoubtedly be shaped by the viral video that had already exploded across social media. Mia, still seated beside him, was rapidly typing updates on her phone, occasionally glancing at Ethan with a mixture of admiration and concern, while passengers around them murmured in hushed tones, some covertly filming him with their phones, others whispering animatedly about what they had just witnessed. In the front of the plane, Karen stood rigid and pale, her posture stiff as a board, every inch of her betraying a carefully maintained composure that was rapidly unraveling beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Travis remained by her side, offering occasional words of quiet reassurance. But even his confident veneer had started to crack, his own phone buzzing with relentless notifications as messages from colleagues and friends poured in, some expressing support, others voicing shock at the emerging scandal. As the wheels touched down with a shuddering thud, the collective exhale from the passengers seemed to reverberate through the fuselage, releasing some of the pent-up tension but leaving behind a lingering sense of unease, as if the very air had become saturated with the realization that the real storm was only just beginning. The flight attendants hurried to complete their final safety checks, their movements brisk and purposeful as they prepared to open the cabin doors, and Ethan could see Karen's hands trembling as she fumbled with the intercom to deliver the standard landing announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport," she began, her voice unsteady and devoid of its usual crisp professionalism. "Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off," and she faltered, glancing sideways at Travis, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod, as if willing her to hold it together for just a few more seconds. Clearing her throat, she continued, "And thank you for flying with us today." The irony of her forced gratitude was not lost on the passengers, some of whom exchanged cynical glances or muttered under their breath, the bitterness of their indignation still fresh and raw. When the seatbelt sign finally blinked off, passengers surged to their feet, retrieving luggage from overhead bins with renewed vigor, as if eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had settled like a dark cloud over the aircraft. Ethan remained seated for a moment, letting the crowd thin out, his gaze drawn to Eleanor, who was struggling with her carry-on bag, her frail hands trembling with fatigue as she tried to maneuver it from the compartment above. Without a word, Ethan rose and approached her, gently taking the bag from her grasp and lowering it to the floor. "Thank you, dear," Eleanor whispered, her eyes glistening with gratitude that went beyond mere words, as if she knew that the kindness Ethan had shown her extended far deeper than just retrieving a piece of luggage. Ethan offered her a reassuring smile, but before he could respond, a firm hand clapped his shoulder and he turned to see Captain Brennan standing behind him, his expression both somber and resolute. "Mr. Wilder," Brennan said, his tone respectful yet measured. "A word, if you don't mind." Nodding, Ethan followed the captain to the jet bridge, where a small cluster of uniformed personnel had already gathered, including the airline's ground manager and 2 security officers, their faces marked by a mixture of urgency and caution. Nearby, Karen stood with her arms crossed defensively, her eyes downcast as if determined to avoid meeting anyone's gaze, while Travis hovered uncertainly between her and the captain, his own sense of loyalty visibly wavering. Brennan motioned for Ethan to step aside with him, away from the growing crowd, and spoke in a low, measured tone that carried the weight of professional responsibility. "I've just been informed that the video from the flight has gone viral," Brennan said, his gaze unwavering. "The airline's PR team is already scrambling to control the fallout, but it's clear that the situation has escalated far beyond what anyone anticipated. I need to know exactly what happened from your perspective. Everything you witnessed, every interaction you had with both the passenger and the crew." Ethan took a deep breath, carefully recounting the entire incident, from the moment Eleanor had asked Karen for water to the increasingly dismissive responses, the callous indifference, and finally his decision to intervene when it became clear that no one else would. Brennan listened intently, his jaw tightening at intervals, and when Ethan finished, the captain exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as if trying to process the magnitude of what had just unfolded. "This is going to be a mess," Brennan muttered under his breath, his composure wavering just long enough for Ethan to catch a glimpse of the frustration simmering beneath his disciplined exterior. "I understand you did what you thought was right," Brennan continued, lifting his gaze to meet Ethan's eyes. "And frankly, from what I'm hearing, I can't say I disagree with your decision to step in. But the airline is going to treat this as a major incident. Passenger mistreatment allegations, public relations nightmare, you name it. I just hope you're prepared for what's coming next." Before Ethan could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension, and both men turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed woman striding down the jet bridge, her expression sharp and commanding. "Captain Brennan," she greeted briskly, holding out her hand. "Jenna Lawson, head of corporate communications. I need to speak with you immediately." Brennan hesitated, glancing between Lawson and Ethan, and after a moment gave a curt nod. "Of course, Ms. Lawson," he replied, gesturing for her to proceed. Lawson's piercing gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, and for a moment, he felt as though she were cataloging him like an asset in a damage control strategy, already calculating the most efficient way to minimize fallout. "We've been contacted by multiple news outlets," Lawson announced crisply. "We need to get ahead of this narrative before it spirals completely out of control. I've arranged for a press conference in the next hour, and we're drafting a preliminary statement acknowledging the incident while emphasizing our commitment to passenger care and respect." Captain, I need your cooperation in presenting a unified front. Brennan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, and his gaze drifted back to Ethan, who remained silently resolute, unwilling to back down from his stance. Just then, another voice joined the fray, Mia, stepping forward with her own phone in hand, her eyes blazing with determination. Ms. Lawson, she said sharply, catching the woman's attention. You might want to reconsider your approach. I'm Mia Chen, journalist and editor for the Civic Integrity Journal. I was on that flight and witnessed the entire incident. If your press conference tries to downplay what happened or spin it as a misunderstanding, it will only make the situation worse. The public has already made up their minds about what they saw, and attempting damage control without addressing the real issue, systemic mistreatment of vulnerable passengers, will only add fuel to the fire. Lawson's expression tightened, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, but Mia didn't back down, her stance unwavering. Instead of focusing on damage control, how about acknowledging the deeper problem and committing to real change? Ignoring it will only lead to more backlash. Brennan glanced between Mia and Lawson, his own sense of duty clearly torn between corporate loyalty and his growing realization that this moment was far larger than just a PR crisis. With a resigned sigh, he turned to Lawson and said, "She's right. We can't just sweep this under the rug. We need to address it honestly, or the public will never forgive us." For the first time, Lawson seemed to falter, her professional mask cracking just enough for a hint of doubt to creep through, and she finally gave a reluctant nod. "Fine," she agreed. "But if we're going to take that route, we'll need to involve the passengers who witnessed the incident and